Hey everyone, welcome back and thank you for being here. Um, my hair was kind of bothering me, so I just took it down and brushed it out. This is going to be the last video for now in our series on Kant. And if you feel like you understand the source text well, I would suggest just skipping this because it's the introduction, um, which will like wrap up his different ideas and show you how they connect to other things. I don't remember what's all in it, but I just want to include it to be thorough. So let's get sharing. Cool. It's pretty long. Um, he talks about the different versions of the categorical imperative. I've said a lot of stuff. I mean, I learned a lot from him, so we might as well read it together. It's the translator, James W. Ellington. I'm pretty sure I couldn't find um someone else's name here. Anyway, it'll be enriching. It'll round out whatever you've understood so far and developed so far. So, and James W. Ellington, University of Connecticut Stores. I don't know exactly. Well, I can find out. 1993. So this person was working at University of Connecticut in the 90s at stores. Um, okay. I'm not sure what else they've done. We've worked with other kind of recent philosophers and scholars of philosophy with their overviews and yeah, we try to stick to the original figure. Kant's moral philosophy is contained in, so thank you to James W. Ellington for this introduction. Um, I similarly include an introduction on utilitarianism that I think is just super helpful because it's kind of hard, like in utilitarianism in particular, where you have multiple thinkers over multiple generations, it's hard to get a comprehensive survey in a single primary source. So that's why I like the introduction on that one. So we'll definitely hit that, maybe even first. I'm not sure. We got to do this first, though, or at least I do. Kant's moral philosophy is contained in three works: Grounding for the Metaphysics of Morals, 1785, Critique of Practical Reason, 1788, and Metaphysics of Morals, 1797. And we're working out of the grounding, which is the first one. Some people might want to include Anthropology from a Pragmatic Point of View, 1798, especially Book 3 of Part 1, where the appetite of power is considered in order to have something of the empirical basis for morality. Some might want to include Religion within the Bounds of Reason Alone, 1793, in order to have an elaboration of the function of the idea of God in Kant's moral system, an idea that is first introduced in Book 2 of the Critique of Practical Reason, quote, Dialectic of Pure Practical Reason. However, in this introduction, only the first three works are considered in any detail. So he'll explain the precise connections between the works. I think I alluded to them previously. I didn't quite know them that well. Um, Hopefully I got them right. And we'll correct them here if not. Toward the end of the preface to the grounding, Kant says that the intention of this work is to seek out and establish the supreme principle of morality. This principle is nothing more nor less than the famous categorical imperative: always act in such a way that you can also will that the maxim of your action should become a universal law. And we just got to that at the end of the last video, where we were at the end of the first section. And that comes out of respect, right? Respect for what? Respect for law as such, and therefore a goodwill commits duties against personal inclination out of respect, probably with some hatred for reason, misology, and yeah, does what is right because it's the right thing to do. No other reason. Um, Kant claims that this is the one supreme principle for the whole field of morals. Remember that the categorical imperative has five main formulations and is the entirety of the law itself. Um, Gives us access to it, grounds it, reveals it, but really is just it is the law. Um, I think Ellington, James W. Ellington will confirm that for us. Kant claims that this is the one supreme principle for the whole field of morals, like we were just saying, you know, including the philosophy of law, politics, as well as the moral requirements of duties to oneself to maintain one's personal integrity and of duties to others and one's association with them, ethics. For those familiar with Kant's system of theoretic philosophy, there is an obvious analogy between the function of the categorical imperative in morals and the function of the transcendental unity of apperception in speculative thought. When Kant claims in the Critique of Pure Reason, Winchester, stop. He gets these rashes. I have to do that in like a lot of these videos because he just constantly licks his skin. I mean, I put ointment on them, but stop. Um, when Kant claims in the Critique of Pure Reason that the synthetic unity of apperception is the highest point to which the whole employment of the understanding must be ascribed, even the whole of general logic, and conformable with logic, even the whole of transcendental philosophy. The transcendental unity of apperception is also like the you can't even say it's the place or it's the time, but it's the crux or the nexus, the edge, so to speak, um, whereby we can maybe say whereby or in the manner under the form of which space and time are elongated. So I kind of always think of it as like the whole world collapsing back here into my forehead. But that's why it's so weirdly like, I mean, it's literally the transcendental. So it's definitely a transcendental model. It's not immanent in the slightest. And then unity of apperception. So it is a unity of the world and the self. And apperception meaning perception of perception. So self-perception. Anyway, both principles function as highest synoptic focal points to which one is led by all lesser principles and from which one descends to all subsidiary principles. The roles played by these two principles in Kant's philosophy are not unlike are not unlike those played by the chief good in Plato's philosophy and the prime mover in Aristotle's philosophy. It's also not unlike there are key differences. It's immanent, first off, but in Deleuze you would link it up with immanence of life, and in Bergson you'd link it would be very similar to the intuition of concrete duration, which you can from which one descends to all subsidiary into analyses, but the analyses can't take you to it. The chief good in Plato's philosophy, if you reflect on the forms for long enough, you can move towards it, but the principles can't take you there. Um, to which one is led by all lesser principles. So not unlike those played by the chief good. So I'm going to assume it doesn't have to be strictly similar to both Plato and Aristotle. I'm not as familiar with the prime mover in Aristotle's philosophy, but probably also not unlike the role of the cogito in Descartes or the conatus or God in Spinoza. There's a lot you could kind of compare as first principles. Anyway, The grounding and the critique of practical reason both deal with the meta-ethical treatment of the foundations and method of the moral doctrine, or normative ethics, contained in the Metaphysics of Morals. The grounding presents moral philosophy as falling under the province of a single supreme principle of pure reason, rather than empirical reason. The critique of practical reason investigates the grounds for justifying such a supreme a priori principle, the categorical imperative. So the first two ground the third one. Um, I probably misspoke in the earlier videos. I thought the metaphysics came before the critique of practical reason. Yeah, I almost think it would have made more sense that way, depending on what he does. I think in the critique of practical reason, he's doing the transcendental argument. Um, I don't know. Could be interesting to investigate one day. The critique of practical reason investigates the grounds for justifying such a supreme a priori principle, the categorical imperative, as being the fundamental principle of the autonomy of reason and action. As such, both works are biased in the direction of high-level abstractions. The Metaphysics of Morals, on the one hand, treats of the varied problems of moral judgment and of choice in concrete situations. On the other hand. So the first two, the grounding for the Metaphysics of Morals and the critique of practical reason, are both meta-ethical doctrines or texts meant to support the coming forth of the later empirical work, which is directly ethical with applicable principles and more specifics. Um, but it's not as purely philosophical according to Kant's own words and account. Then, right, that it's not as philosophical. That one, that's the Metaphysics of Morals. On the other hand, treats of the varied problems of moral judgment and of choice in concrete situations. Moral philosophy is a complex subject, and Kant treats it systematically in these various treatises dealing with one topic at a time. Kant never claims that he discovered the categorical imperative. In fact, he says in the Critique of Practical Reason that it would be outright silly of anyone to claim that he had discovered the moral law as something really new, as if the world up to then had been ignorant of what constitutes moral duty, or else had been quite wrong about such duty. This supreme principle is, rather, ordinarily presumed in all moral judgments. It is a working criterion supposedly employed by any rational agent as a guide for making his or her own choices and judgments, but without his or her being necessarily able to formulate it and make it explicit. If there is a consistent standard according to which everyday actions are judged as being moral or not, then the precise formulation of such a standard would be practically helpful and theoretically enlightening. It is here that Kant claims he has made a worthwhile contribution in the precise formulation. He formulates the categorical imperative in some 5 different ways in the second section of the grounding. Each formula is expressed in quite different terms, but when they are properly understood, they can be seen to amount to the same thing. Consequently, Kant has given the world 5 different formulations of one supreme moral law, not 5 different moral laws, as some commentators have claimed. So that's what I said earlier about it being the totality of the law as well. So the categorical imperative is the law. And that's why it's like the cogito, it has a sort of, don't, generative of generative, like it is self-creating. It's immanent. It's an immanent concept, an immanent truth. Self-revealing, like but also self-existing. God would be there too for Spinoza, where the essence of God is existence. The idea running through all of these formulations is that of autonomy. The moral law is imposed by reason itself and is not imposed externally, heteronomously, as for example would be the case if all actions were directed to the attainment of happiness, conceived as a state of the subject, in which he had no unsatisfied desires but had complete well-being and contentment, or as would be the case if all actions were commanded by the will of God. So goodness in Kant is not, I mean, I've always thought that was kind of worthless, right? Like doing it for fear, doing it for praise. I guess I was always a deontologist, but there are things I don't like. Anyway, there are things I find really beautiful about his a priori arguments and his ideas. And then there are things that I find harsh and non-conducive to human living, non-conducive to grace and forgiveness. I mean, there should be duties for forgiveness and grace too. These various formulations culminate in that of the so-called kingdom of ends. This is the ideal of a moral community in which each member would act in such a way that if all other members acted in this way, then a community of free and equal members would result in which each member would, as he realizes his own purposes, also further the aims of his fellow members. Excuse me. In such a community, each member freely disciplines himself under the very same rules that would be prescribed by him for others. The result would be that each member would act as a law unto himself, and hence autonomously, but yet would cooperate harmoniously with every other member. Such an ideal kingdom of ends has law. That's, noteworthy right there. Um, it's not paternalistic necessarily because as long as each individual has a self-justice following their own law, and that includes certain kind of key linkages, like respecting other people and respecting other people's autonomy and their laws for themselves, as long as they don't hold laws for others that are unjust. That's the kingdom of ends, right? There's a lot of flexibility there as long as we're not dominating and oppressing each other. There's plenty of room for difference, plenty of room for different conceptions of a good life, different interpretations, different approaches, different solutions. But generally these approaches and solutions are not like they have negative consequences, right? It's not just an idea that you think that people should be like not have access to food stamps. That's not just an idea. That's people. It's not just an idea that you think that um like seniors should not have access to medical care or that undocumented immigrants should not have access to medical care. Those are people. It doesn't matter if they're citizens or not, if you're an ethicist or a Kantian. Um, that's the universal law that you're setting down in some way. So clearly frustrated about recent events and trying to be kind. Such an ideal kingdom of ends has law as its formal ordering principle. So notice that it's not its formal ordering code. It's not its formal ordering document. It's formal ordering written rules, rules as written, if you're a D&D player. There's also rules as intended, where like on Twitter, not the new name, Twitter, um, they will explain. Also, I haven't actually played D&D since it got bought, but Wizards of the Coast would explain like, no, we meant it this way. It's not meant to be gamified or manipulated in that way. We intended it to be used this way. In my classroom design, I actually am really thoughtful about ways that my systems can be broken. And so if which is why I'm so particular, um, anyway, I think good systems have to be thought out in that way and expected to be like manipulated and broken. That was the Federalist 51, I think, is where James Madison argues that the checks and balances and competing bureaucracies of the uh, dual federal state systems with different agencies, they didn't really have that many agencies, but they had some, um, were meant to compartmentalize ambitious attempts at overtaking. So, I've done a lot of recording today, and I don't remember why I brought that up. But I think it was something about like our government was designed um, to be broken. Yeah, that's what it was. My classroom systems are designed to be like broken. If there's something that is allowable, or I didn't notice or didn't mention, then it's fair game. That's not your fault. You're not in trouble for doing something that I didn't prohibit, um, or that I explicitly left open. And I mean, they tried to find ways to prevent those breakages. Like that's how they designed it to be broken by not being broken. In my classes, if there's something that I notice happens one semester, I fix it for the next semester. Anyway, law is the categorical imperative. Do it to others as you'd have them done to you. Golden rule, ends in itself, kingdom of ends, autonomy, and natural law. It's part of the metaphysics of nature. So it has law as its formal ordering principle. I really cannot say enough that we cannot translate. You need legislators. Um, in an answer to the question, what is enlightenment? Kant shows us that we can't, we can never set down a set of legislation or interpretation of a church tradition or a religious tradition or a government tradition, um, and say that no future generation need reinterpret it or need ask questions about it or make it make sense to them. They have that right. They always have that right. And in fact, that's what understanding, enlightenment, and truth are. And so you need to have a just society for Kant, you need people that are good, which is not like it's not really something that just happens. Um, I don't think people are inherently bad, but I do what I do think is that again, like he says in enlightenment, like people have a tendency to want to like stop trying, basically, or depend on somebody else or trust somebody else too much. And then like it's almost like moral capitalism where you have to hold each other accountable to not take advantage of like for you not to take advantage of me. Um, and anytime I let my guard down, the other person does that. Like that's kind of what we see. So if you won't decide how your life is going to go, somebody else will do it for you. But there's no text that can do that. There's no written constitution. And that the important part here is there's no utopianism. There's no like um point at which we could write down the perfect law that would fix all the problems and then we wouldn't have to work anymore. There might not even be like an eschatological moment or a messianism where democracy won't require work anymore. All right, let's keep reading. Such an ideal kingdom of ends has law, and the kingdom of ends is when everybody's treating everybody else as an end in itself, end in themselves, and is adhering to strong duties, negative and positive, what they should not do, negative duties, as well as what they should do, positive duties, like Samaritan duties, like helping somebody out, giving back to the community. Um, Personally, I find that it's really important that my labor, whether I'm paid for it or not, but especially if I'm paid for it, um, is ethical. Teaching is something that is really safe for that. Okay, such an ideal kingdom of ends has law as its formal ordering principle. Now, a law must apply universally and permit no exceptions within its domain. If something is right for me to do, then it must be so for everybody else. In formal terms, the first formulation in the grounding of the categorical imperative states that one should act only on that maxim that can at the same time be willed to become a universal law. A maxim is nothing but a rule that is followed in any deliberately intentional act. To get to Paris, take an Air France flight. In this example, there is an aim, the means for attaining it, and the relevant circumstances could be elaborated. In any maxim, the aim, means, and circumstances can always be identified. The maxim of an immoral act cannot be willed to become a universal law. When you tell a lie, you do not will that everybody else lie also. For if you did so, then nobody would believe your lie, and your lying would never work to get you what you want. When you lie, you will that everybody else tell the truth and believe that what you are saying is true, for this is the only way your lie will work. In lying, you simply take exception to the law that says everyone should tell the truth. Clearly, from what Kant says in the grounding at AK 436, I'm not sure. I think the AK is short for a German word. The kingdom of ends has not only a form, which is the legality examined in the preceding paragraph, but also a matter. Its free and equal members and the aims or purposes they pursue. To say that they are equally free means that any one of them, has not the right either by coercion or deception to subject any of the others to his own private interests. Consequently, another and oft quoted formulation of the moral law states that one should always act in such a way that humanity, either in oneself or in others, is always treated as an end in itself and never merely as a means. We've talked a lot about not treating other people as means, or not merely as a means. The important point there is that they can be a means if you're like, especially if you're collaborating with them, and they should also be an end in themselves. to themselves, and they should also be an end in themselves to you, right? So I should be an end in myself to myself. I should be an end in myself to you, and each of you should be an end in yourself to me, which you are. And there's a lot of you. Um, it's just an honor to have so many students. Um, but yeah, the part I always miss is treating yourself as an end. So like setting appropriate boundaries, being like, hey, no, I'm gonna go to bed. We'll figure this out tomorrow. Um, whatever happens, happens. Like, and then so a lot of the discussion in deontology becomes competing duties. What do you do when the duties are at conflict with each other because of scheduling or something like that? Or because of a crisis or a triage? How do you save medical is the obvious answer or the obvious example because like um triage literally would mean to like it's a verb which means to parse which concerns need to be addressed first in a crisis situation where you cannot fix everything or save everyone. It's a bit like grief. In some ways, grief will lead to a triage through the radical acceptance. You cannot triage and save people if you cannot grieve. Okay, never merely as a means. If a person is treated as a mere means, then he is treated as nothing more than a thing without purposes of her own, rather than as a self-determining rational agent. Now, despite terminological differences, the formula of the end in itself considered in the preceding paragraph is actually equivalent to the previous formula of universal law. It's isomorphic, which means it's just a reconfiguration of the same thing with no lost properties and just different emphases. It's a different elemental expression of the whole. According to the formula of universal law, any violation of the formula of the end in itself must be wrong, i.e., when someone is treated as a mere means, his purposes are regarded as not counting. When the maxim of such treatment is universalized, the agent of such treatment must be willing to be so treated in return. But here is a contradiction, for no one wants his purposes to count for nothing. Conversely, any violation of the formula of universal law always involves making oneself an exception to the rules, as when one lies, to treat somebody else not as less than human, but to want to still be treated as human. By doing so, he makes the aims of others mere means to his own selfish aims. He exploits others thereby, and the formula of the end in itself forbids such exploitation. So, yeah, I mean, you don't even need like a duty not to manipulate or a duty not to exploit. It's there baked into what the categorical imperative is at the metaethical level to begin with. Consequently, according to the formula of the end in itself, any violation of the formula of universal law must be wrong. The two formulations mutually imply each other and must therefore be equivalents. And so any act that violates one violates the other. And um, if it seems to not violate one, but it does seem to violate the other, then it still violates both. As Kant points out at AK at AC 436, when the unity of the will's form, universality, is combined with the plurality of its matter, will's ends, then there arises a totality of the will's system of ends, i.e., a kingdom of ends. So the universalized plurality of all of my different desires is all of our different desires, I guess, our ends. The preceding exposition started with the formula of the kingdom of ends, and from this formulation distinguished the formula of universal law and the formula of the end in itself. There is still another formulation that derives from the kingdom of ends. We went the other way. We in the process of the grounding and the lectures I gave, we went universal law, natural law, end in itself, kingdom of ends, autonomy of reason. I mean, and I really think those last three are flexible, how you start hitting them. Uh, so the formula of autonomy is also derived from the kingdom of ends, and that'll be our fourth one in this presentation. The members of this kingdom are not only subject to the rule of law, but are also co-authors or legislators of the law because of the universalizable maxims according to which they act. Thereby is the system a community. Anyone who steps outside this community and imposes law upon the other members without subjecting himself to the law is not treating those members as ends in themselves, i.e., the formula of the end in itself is violated, nor is he regarding his maxims as universal laws, i.e., the formula of universal law is violated. He might employ a system of rewards and punishments to make the members always obey his laws, but they would not do so autonomously. Much the same holds in the case of a religious ethics, which conceives of God as a legislator issuing arbitrary commands with threats of damnation, unless those commands are obeyed. Likewise, too, a government system that taxes things they don't want citizens doing and provides tax breaks for things they do want them doing. And then there are other things like fines for punishments, not just taxes. Um, Taxes I had in mind were like taxes on alcohol, taxes on gambling, taxes on nicotine, and in states where it's legal, taxes on marijuana. Usually it funds education. But these are all called sin taxes and are meant to dissuade. Um, like the tax on cigarettes in New York can be like $7 a box, which is 50%, 60 or 70%. Anyway, it can be even more, $8, $9 a box. I mean, like a pack of cigarettes in New York with normal taxes costs like I used to smoke. I used to smoke American Spirits. I quit. I smoked them for like 7 or 8 years, I think. It wasn't always American Spirits. For a long time it was though, yellows. And I quit them in 2023, January, before my ex went missing, and I haven't picked them back up. And I dreamt about them for a while. I don't dream about them anymore. But the when I lived in New York, there are places that sell them. Um, there are places that smuggle them into the city and sell them for a lower tax. They're not as cheap as they would be in like a state like Texas, where they're not as taxed heavily. But they still have to pay the logistics of getting them from halfway across the states. And the ones that weren't like that were like almost $20. Literally, like probably are $20 now. And I think in Texas they're like $9 now. So 9 or 10 plus tariffs. I don't know. Tobacco might be mostly domestic, but the transportation costs are still going to be hit by tariffs. Logistic costs are going to go up. There's a lot of stuff that would have made their production, their cultivation, and their transportation cheaper that is not. made in the US, and that will have an impact on that industry. Do to do. So yeah, tariffs are like the prime example of what we're talking about here. Um, Someone might employ a system of rewards and punishments to make the members always obey their laws. They might extort billions of dollars from the institutions. They might force law firms to work pro bono for them, which is probably also a violation of the Emoluments Clause because government cannot be gifted anything for free. This is why AOC Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had to spend like $3,000 renting a dress for the Met Gala. Um, just because like they could not, I don't know. And I think she got it, like she had to pay for that herself. It was for a charity event. It got donated to charity. There's a whole scandal about like Republicans trying to like make her like say that she broke some ethical rules and make her pay more. And basically what they said was that because she got it at cost instead of the company trying to make a profit off of her, she was getting a discount. And I mean, like, come on, if you're going to do that and you're going to say that multi-billion dollar uh, th- payments from universities, like hundreds of billions of dollars, right? Um, or free legal aid, like, dude, it makes no sense. It's embarrassing. So embarrassing. It's a laughing stock of a country. Arbitrary commands with threats of damnation unless those commands are obeyed. The formula of autonomy states that one should always act in such a way that his will can at the same time regard itself as legislating in its maxims universal laws. This formula of autonomy is the one that most clearly indicates that a moral imperative must be categorical rather than hypothetical. So hypothetical would be particular to a conditional state with contextual specifics a posteriori. An imperative is first of all a directive to act in a certain way. It is not a statement of fact. Furthermore, if the imperative is categorical, then the action commanded by it should be done because that action is the right thing to do, and not because of some payoff or advantage offered by the action. It's the word hypothetical used here comes from a classic in logic called the hypothetical syllogism. If P then Q, P therefore Q. So let's say the conditional is if it's noon and not raining, which is technically if P and R. But let's say if it's noon, it's daytime. It's noon. And then we can conclude, therefore, that it's daytime. Anyway, that's the hypothetical we get is the final part. Because the imperative is given without reference to an outcome or a syllogism or any kind of conditional statement. It's not a hypothetical imperative. It's rather categorical. And because it's categorical, it's universal. Or it's of a category, it's of the same kind, a common type. A will that obeys a law for an ulterior motive is acting on a hypothetical imperative. A rule that is formally legal does not violate the formula of universal law and also just does not violate the formula of the end in itself, may be put into effect through rewards and punishments. Whoever obeys such a legal and just rule to gain the reward or avoid some penalty does so for an ulterior motive. His actions accord with duty, but is not done from duty. We talked about this case before. He has followed a hypothetical imperative, but not a categorical one. For a rule that is both legal and just to be a moral law means that the rule must also be autonomous and in no way dependent upon any ulterior motive. Only then is the rule a categorical imperative rather than a hypothetical one. And these are best seen in instances where it's actually risky or dangerous or incurs some harm, suffering, or goes against inclination to fulfill a duty. At Act 440, Kant sums up his progress in the first two sections of the grounding by saying that the principle of autonomy is the sole principle of morals, and that this has been shown by merely analyzing the concepts of morality. In the process of this analysis, the principle of morals is found to be necessarily a categorical imperative, which commands nothing but this very autonomy. Hereby he fulfills the suggestion made at the end of the preface. The best method will be to proceed analytically from ordinary moral knowledge to a determination of the supreme principle of morality. The work and criterion that is reflected in ordinary moral judgments, such as helping others in distress is good, telling lies is bad, etc., has been made explicit, though not discovered, since that criterion is implicit in every morally good act that was ever done. Right? There's an inactivistic component to the maxim. And that criterion has been given various alternative formulations that reflect the different aspects of that criterion. But even though the supreme principle of morality has thus far in the grounding been investigated and established, what about that principle itself? How is the principle of autonomy to be justified? It must be justified, or else the subordinate principles which depend on it, such as the categorical imperative and the principles of jurisprudence and of ethics, will be questionable. The third section of the grounding prepares the way, but the critique of practical reason has the job of justifying the principle of autonomy. Since this introduction is concerned primarily with the grounding, I shall indicate very briefly what Kant says about the problems of one why should be moral. So it looks like we have 4.5 pages left. And I think we're done covering the categorical imperative in all 5 versions. Why should one be good unless he thereby attains happiness in this life, or else the promise of such in the afterlife? As we have already seen, the categorical imperative commands us to be good, irrespective of any payoff. Here we have, of course, the age-old conflict between duty and self-interest. The duty part says there must be a categorical imperative, while the self-interest part says that there are only hypothetical imperatives. Do such and such if you want to gain this or that. The conflict involved here concerns mainly a question regarding the possibility of doing whatever is done because of a special kind of incentive, even if other kinds of incentives are present. What sorts of incentives qualify as moral? Can purely rational considerations be sufficient to determine the will to action, not only by providing a rule for distinguishing right from wrong, if one wanted to act on that rule, but also by supplying an incentive that is sufficient for performing the action? Purely rational considerations are independent of experience, i.e., are a priori rather than empirical. Practical action differs from unintentional or automatic motion in that action is rational inasmuch as it is always guided by a conception of what is being done. This conception can always be formulated as a rule or maxim that can logically be nothing but categorical or hypothetical. If the maxim is hypothetical, the action is empirically determined. If categorical, then the action is purely a priori determined. The possibility of acting on categorical imperative, or on a categorical imperative, means the same thing as the possibility of not being determined to act because of some empirical condition. E.g., someone tells the truth even when telling a lie might promote his personal happiness and comfort. Moral concepts require one to act from respect for the idea of conformity to law, incentive, in accordance with the capacity of one's maxim to be a universal law or rule, and for the sake of end, a self-regulating community of free members, the kingdom of ends. Not one of these ideas, incentive, rule, or end, can be adequately exemplified in experience, and they must therefore all be a priori conceptions. Insofar as the categorical imperative provides criteria for determining what should be done by pointing out an end, a rule, and an incentive, it is a practical principle. But there are certain limitations when one uses this principle to decide about moral character. Any overt action that is contrary to lawfulness, such as lying, cheating, or stealing, is unjust. It is also morally wrong because it could not have been done for any morally acceptable reason. Any action that is unjust and morally wrong is thereby blameworthy. But what about the use of this principle to determine merit? An action may be just, rule, and legal end, but yet be morally indeterminate incentive. Does the man who pays his taxes do so because it is the right thing to do, or because he wants to avoid the penalties imposed on delinquents? We cannot tell, and neither can he really. Moral merit can only be known to God, the searcher of hearts. So, on the one hand, the validity of the categorical imperative implies that there may be causes for action that are independent of empirical influences, i.e., one can act on a priori grounds alone. But on the other hand, if an action can have both pure and empirical grounds, which grounds were the determining ones, pure or empirical? Kant calls this a question of transcendental freedom, and much of the analytic of the critique of practical reason is devoted to it. His solution is to say that for practical purposes, one can be sure that he is free, but one cannot fully grasp cognitively how transcendental freedom is possible. One knows that he can act autonomously, and thereby is the categorical imperative vindicated as a guide for action. But since knowledge, cognition, is a manifestation of the transcendental autonomy of intelligence, he cannot rise to a higher vantage point in order to attain a full cognitive grasp of the ultimate grounds of both knowledge and action. I've always thought that self-awareness was difficult because it would fill itself, but then not have any room left over to know itself still. And any room spent left knowing that new part would then not be known by any other part. There's a sense in which only God, or nature, in the fullness of all of its ends and people and animals and flows and affects and causations, knows all the has all of the mind, is all of the mind, operates the mind. But what I was going to say is there's a way in which only the other can know me, and only I can really know the other. It's very different from self-knowledge because self-knowledge is limited. It's interesting. It contradicts eidetics because the eidetic noetic intuition should include the self. And in that sense, eidetic noetic knowledge is absolute and comprehensive. But in another sense, insofar as it only gets the fleeting singularity or surface of the outside or the world of which it's exposed through and produced by, um, the the elemental expressions we get from meeting each other has a more and seeking diversifications of rhizomaticity has a more comprehensive intuition of the total interconnected suffering and needs and well-being of the whole of life and the world. So, since knowledge cognition is a manifestation of the transcendental autonomy of intelligence, she cannot rise to a higher vantage point in order to attain a full cognitive grasp of the ultimate grounds of both knowledge and action. This is also why you can't know that you could have done better until you've learned, like after the fact. And so why like it's best to just try or do or trust or rest or strive in whatever intuition and prudent mode you feel is appropriate. Whatever mode you feel is appropriate due to prudence and wisdom. All of the foregoing topics that are treated in the grounding and the critique are preparation for the systematic presentation of doctrine in the Metaphysics of Morals, which has two parts called respectively the metaphysical principles of right, which is jurisprudence, and the metaphysical principles of virtue, which is ethics. So right, presumably, and jurisprudence has to do with inalienable rights and legal rights. Ethics having to do with what you should do, what your soul should constitute, what would be an excellent human. Today, many philosophers would call Kant's treatment of the foundations and methods of morals as contained in the Grounding and the Critique, the first two books, meta-ethical, and the doctrine of the Metaphysics of Morals, his normative ethics. I was taught that it was like that normative ethics were always meta-ethical, and that something where you're being specific with like actual print like rules for action um is pretty descriptive, more like descriptive ethics. It's not so much normative. Like normative is giving the rule that you can use to deduce the description, the ought to determine what you will do in a situation. This is a good way to emphasize again that the former two treatises are slanted in the direction of high-level abstractions. People who read mainly, but I haven't read the Metaphysics of Morals, and his jurisprudence probably does have quite a bit of normativity in there. There's probably quite a bit of normativity and not just description. But yeah, grain of salt, always with a grain of salt. Because there's always a grain of salt, because every sentence is a reduction. People who read mainly the Grounding and the Critique often criticize Kant for having his head in the clouds and for not being convincingly capable of dealing with concrete cases. A reading of the Metaphysics of Morals will show anyone how unfounded such criticisms are. To be sure, the principle of autonomy, the moral law, as examined in the Grounding and as justified in the Critique, is perfectly general and applies to all rational agents as such, to agents who are able to act from reason and not merely from inclinations of sense. Accordingly, the moral law makes no distinctions between God and man. However, duties cannot be ascribed to a perfectly rational agent, such as God, inasmuch as such an agent always acts in accordance with the moral law, because in this case, there are no senses involved, like material senses, I guess, because God is supposed to be noumena in Kant. Eh. There are no senses involved to incline such a being by means of self-interest to act contrary to the moral law. But in the case of humans, account must be taken of their desires and interests, which may urge action contrary to the moral law. Indeed, the relation of human beings to the law is always one of obligation, since man has both reason and senses. Humans alone have duties. Animals do not act rationally, but solely by instinct and sensuous inclinations, and hence have no obligations or duties. Man is the only living being that blushes and the only one that needs to. There's a way in which this is used, again, to abuse animals and to dehumanize people who do not act a certain way. So if you're not a good human, we can remove you from the community and punish you. That's and that's totally not what I want to advocate. That's totally not what I think is appropriate. But that is one way that Kant gets abused. His theories get misused. Because I don't even think he thinks that. Descartes was abusive to animals. Kant maybe. There are two senses in which the categorical imperative is just productively true. It's productive in the sense that whatever I do or you do will repercuss into the future. It will set new standards. It is always new legislation. It may be quantum mechanically true at a metaphysical level as well. And this is like the hokey, like you attract certain vibes kind of thing. Again, that can be tonal. You speak in a certain way based on your perceptions and what tones and rhythms you communicate with resonate with other people in certain ways. And the resonances, this is all material. The resonances in the melody and emotion of the voice and the feeling of the communication. Um, Man, I got really far off on a tangent and forgot what I was saying. Oh, they can be metaphysical or material. And so again, like you attract there, you sort of like the attract things in that sense based on what you do. But the quantum mechanical attraction would be at something more perceptual and uh, self-generative. So like you organize your soul in a certain way, and then reality organizes itself in a certain way to harmonize with the soul so that you can perceive each other. And I try to always stay open to that one so that I can see how I need to reorganize myself to make the world better. Either practically, like pragmatically, or in terms of like the rules with which I treat myself. Like I need to be patient with myself so I can be patient with my students. I need to advocate for rest for both myself and my students so that we can both rest. So, yeah, the reason I brought that up here has to do with the dehumanizing potential of the categorical imperative, but also with the possibility of the ontological reality of it, meaning I wanted to present the consideration that whether you agree with it morally or not, it may be a state of nature that you're facing and always legislating, whether you or I realize it. So, respect animals and respect each other. We should be good. I am not saying be a vegetarian, but I try to be grateful when I eat meat and just be grateful when I eat in general. Try to be grateful in general. I think like everything incurs suffering and lots of labors are miserable, and I'm sure there's lots of parts of the world that are miserable. Well, there are parts of the world that are conflict ridden, bloody, genocidal. Um, So like just breathing is something to be grateful for because it's affectually and contingently and tangentially related to all that suffering at the same time right now. So yeah, I can't move past like dehumanizing animals like that to say they aren't rational. Like my animals are rational. They understand things. They know rules. They feel they can see patterns at the very least, but they like know when they've done something wrong. You see videos of dogs. Um, so OpenAI released their video generator recently. Apparently all videos are now sus. Yay. But if you own animals or have animals or cohabitate and share your life with animals, then you've seen them do fun things and seen them tear things up, and seen them get in trouble for that and know that they can't do that and then still do it again. Like my German Shepherd, for example, eats the cat food and he gets sheepish whenever he has eaten the cat food. He's on a diet because he's getting older and he has bad hips and he needs to be on a diet. He's a little bit overweight and I buy him really good food and it's like high protein, probably more protein than he needs at his age. High energy food. Yeah, I'm talking about you. And Sophia, she's also very intelligent. She found me out. She sought me out repeatedly and has a total like intuition. Like, I mean, this distinction between instinct and reason just goes back to the problem with intuition versus analysis. The concepts of human desire and its many kinds are empirical, to be sure. These empirical concepts, in conjunction with a supreme moral principle, yield the various classes of specific duties that make up the body of doctrine contained in the Metaphysics of Morals. In analogous fashion, the empirically given concept of matter, when determined by the transcendental predicates conveyed in the pure categories of the understanding, yield the body of doctrine regarding corporeal nature that is contained in the metaphysical foundations of natural science. The empirical concepts of desires and interests are what relate the fundamental law of morality to the human condition. But this use of empirical concepts does not make the propositions of the body of moral metaphysical doctrine empirical in the sense that its propositions are dependent on empirical evidence and are thereby true only contingently. If this were so, then the metaphysics of morals would contain nothing but hypothetical imperatives. However, it comprises a system of particular categorical imperatives. I guess that's why it's a normative ethics still. That makes sense. So I wouldn't call it a descriptive ethics. I didn't gotcha Kant or this translator. Sometimes we just figure things out. Thou such as thou shalt honor contracts, thou shalt not commit suicide, thou shalt not overindulge in food and drink, etc. Indeed, moral philosophy is such that its a priori part exhausts what is called doctrine proper. Moral philosophy does have an empirical part contained in what Kant calls practical anthropology, but the contribution of the latter is merely supplemental, inasmuch as morals are concerned with what should be done rather than with what is actually done. Such anthropology considers, for example, the frequent failure in what should be done and how such mistakes can be avoided in the future. In this respect, moral doctrine contrasts with natural doctrine. The empirical laws of nature investigated in empirical physics comprise the largest part of natural science, while the transcendental system of nature contained in the Analytic of Principles and the Critique of Pure Reason, and the metaphysical system of nature contained in the Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science, make up but a small yet important part of the science of nature. So is natural philosophy is largely empirical, only smallly theoretical or transcendental? So moral philosophy is largely transcendental, only smallly empirical. This probably, and I'm not sure whether it's justified or not, but this probably has something to do with the fact that the natural world is about the outside and is about what is there, and it's given in that outside, through that outside. Um, Nobody's contesting that, at least when it's in front of us and not when it's in a video, like AI, or it's in a photo. No one's contesting that the evidence drawn upon is non-existent. But much like Plato, bad actors with power very much want to contest that they don't have to follow the rules like everybody else does, and that they can abuse people. And so you need a very strong theoretical frame for something so immaterial as a course of conduct, and a source of justification for said conduct. Kant's approach to moral philosophy involves going from the fundamental principle of autonomy to specific rules of duty. We saw how he goes from the goodwill through there to the principle of autonomy or the categorical imperative. But then this translator is showing us how in multiple books Kant goes from that categorical imperative to particular um, things that you should or should not do, which are still different formulations of the categorical imperative, elemental formulations expressing different elements, different sides or aspects or edges. And then finally down to cases in the final instance. Moral philosophy is intended for what can be realized in action amid changing circumstances. Kant is often upbraided for having given the world, in the instance of the categorical imperative, an empty formula with no power for determining rules sufficiently specific for any effective guidance in concrete situations. It is also said that the prescriptions which he does offer are so lacking in flexibility that they do not fit either the changing situations everyone faces or the various values among which one has to choose, which is what I was saying. There's either a conflict or they're too inflexible for human experience. Both the grounding and the critique deal primarily with the categorical imperative as a universal principle, but the Metaphysics of Morals provides the reader with a better balanced perspective. Even though this last mentioned treatise deals mainly with general categories of duties, those duties nevertheless are oriented toward concrete action. And in the Metaphysical Principles of Virtue, which was the second part of the Metaphysics of Morals, yeah. And in the Metaphysical Principles of Virtue, the reader will even find sections devoted to casuistical questions. So casuistry is whenever you use moral intuition in case studies and try to extrapolate between case studies. It seems to have, yeah, it seemed like it was used by Aristotle in his examples. His way of reasoning is very casuistry, casuist. Um, he uses all sort, he like pretty much only does examples, and he wants the form to be consistent. I guess Plato did too. The dialectic, the Socratic method, the Olympus method. For example, in the days before anti-rabies serum, would a man bitten by a mad dog do wrong to commit suicide, lest in his final raving sickness he might himself uncontrollably bite someone? Obviously, the maxim upon which he acted would be quite different from that of someone who threw himself out of a high window upon learning that he had been financially wiped out in the 1929 stock market crash. We might expect things to get better for the person undergoing the the acute suffering of the crash versus an incurable sickness. So, um, and the question of whether there's a different provision for suicide in cases of mortality versus cases of potential harm to others. And then you're getting really problematic with other casuistry about um, needing to be consistent with the principles necessary for like um, capital punishment, or like somebody is going to always cause harm to somebody else so they can't be allowed to exist anymore. Usually that person can be detained even at high cost to society. And I think that that's maintaining human dignity in any kind of incarceration system where incarceration is necessary to prevent further harm to others, which it usually is not. Usually it's a capitalist farm for labor and for money laundering, government contracts for to private companies. Um, but like say that you captured Hitler and instead of and their considerations are to either kill them, uh, or even if you gave them the like option to decide themselves, do you want to be incarcerated or do you want to leave? But the fact that they're different, the fact that Kant seems to leave room for them to be different means that the specificity of the categorical imperative's universalizability may be more nuanced and individuatable uh, if we appropriately take into account all the context of affective necessity and personal impact and input. The field of the moral laws legislation has two main subdivisions. The first one is the domain of justice and legality, and Kant calls this one the domain of right. Accordingly, the first part of the Metaphysics of Morals is called the Metaphysical Principles of the Doctrine of Right, and it deals with jurisprudence, or the law. But keep in mind, this is law as right. Moral law as right, not moral law as codified or as written. I want to know if Tugend is related to arete. Virtue or good quality. Let's do translate. And we're going to go from I translated to Greek, and it was German. Artsy. Yep. Excellence, skill, capacity, power, integrity. Specifically through an action or practice, though, whereas right is something a priori, um, and self-causal, autonomous. Right is autonomous, whereas virtue is practiced. I think that's accurate. Okay. The second part of the Metaphysics of Morals is called, um, it's also the second main subdivision of the moral laws legislation, and that is the domain of virtue. The second part of the Metaphysics of Morals is called the Metaphysical Principles of the Doctrine of Virtue instead of the Doctrine of Right. To pay or not to pay one's debts, to respect or violate somebody's rights are matters of justice or injustice that can be rewarded or punished. But virtue or vice, merit or depravity, are internal and personal things that are out of reach of the law. Interesting. So the doctrine of right is self-determining and a priori in that sense, but then is about how to regulate that in others and what to do if it's violated, which is a posteriori. The state of the soul is practiced and um, improved or detrimented, cannot be, can be hindered, it can be really hard to be a good person in a bad world. It can incur more suffering than than it needs to. But apparently, according to the text, it's not something, it's more a priori than the right, than the jurisprudence. I don't know. I would need to read the full expositions to see, um, to then summarize at this level what's going on there. Kant distinguishes legality and morality quite succinctly in terms of the concept of legislation, which involves a rule to be followed and an incentive for following it. Ethical legislation makes something a duty and declares that the appropriate reason for fulfilling that duty is the very fact that the something under consideration is a duty. E.g., no one, or for example, no one can be compelled by law to be beneficent, though he may be taxed and this money then distributed in welfare payments. But if someone is beneficent, this beneficence is its own reason for being. In the case of juridical legislation, rewards and punishments are attached as incentives to the fulfillment of the duties involved. E.g., if one does not pay his taxes, he will be fined. Ethical legislation is internal, while the juridical is external. Jurisprudence is the science of external legislation, and the supreme principle of right says that one should act externally in such a way that the free use of one's choice may not interfere with anyone's freedom insofar as his freedom agrees with universal law. I mentioned that earlier as well. We can have some discrepancy in what our laws are for ourselves as long as they don't interact or interfere, as long as they don't interfere with other people's laws for themselves. There are probably some very extended circumstances in which that could still be a problem, like finite resources. Um, to what extent does the other person have the utmost capacity to realize themselves? I did read Theory of Justice by Rawls. That's where I did a lot of thinking about ends and deontology and freedom. Pretty good book. I didn't take a class for it. I just read it. I read too fast. I didn't understand everything. It's like 500 pages. Insofar as this person's freedom agrees with universal law. Okay. Ethical obligations are discharged only when they are done out of respect for the law. Such performance involves merit over and above merely being free from blame. All juridical duties, when done for duty's sake, and not merely for some reward or the avoidance of punishment, are thereby ethical duties. But there is a second kind of ethical duty called duties of virtue. These are the ones which are considered in the metaphysical principles of virtue and are those for which no external legislation is possible. They include such duties as not to commit suicide, not to overindulge in food and drink, not to lie, not to become anyone's doormat, uh, to be beneficent, to be grateful, to be sympathetic, not to be prideful, uh, not to be full of calumny, not to be full of mockery, and yet others. I don't know what calumny is. Like maybe calamity or the making of false and defamatory statements about someone in order to damage their reputation. Slander. So full of propensity for slander and like saying things that aren't true, I guess. Yeah, full of haphazard speech. It is not the intention of this introduction to provide the reader with a bird's eye view of the metaphysics of morals, which is longer than the grounding and the critique combined. I have intended merely to give enough information about the metaphysics of morals to impress upon the reader that he cannot get a balanced impression of Kant's conception of moral philosophy by considering only the grounding and the critique. Also, he cannot fully grasp the metaphysics of morals without first studying the other two treatises, especially the grounding. Kant's treatment of moral philosophy is a profound and lengthy affair, and most certainly the only place to start is with the grounding, which lies just ahead. And heaven help the one who enters thereon. Why do I say this? There are two main reasons. First, Kant writes for a rather sophisticated audience. He assumes readers who are well on their way toward rational knowledge. He supposes that they have a rudimentary grasp of the basic points and do not need to have the consequences of those points elaborated in detail. For example, he says that there is one categorical imperative which can be formulated in 5 different ways, yet he does not provide the reader much help in seeing how those formulations are equivalent. In fact, several generations of students and commentators have been confused on this point, including John Stuart Mill, who we also read. Second, he has such a firm grip on his material that he does not always judge wisely as to where the reader may stand in need of extra help if he is not to go astray. But students, be of good cheer. Your teachers, one hopes, will be able to lead you through the maze. If they falter, consult the ensuing selected bibliography for further help. And never forget that struggling with Kant or any other great but difficult philosopher can be very rewarding. And I'll add this last bit is probably a rite of passage that we've all been through. So I'm going to wrap it again, guys. That is the end of our stuff on Kant. I may come back and do the second section in the grounding at some point, or some of these other texts that, they would be quite lengthy lecture series, especially if we're reading the text together, which I always want to do. But it'll keep me busy for years to come. Thanks for being here. Let me know if I can help. Um, Animals are resting, so they will not pay the tax today. But Kant is so strenuous. I'm glad to be done. I mean, I feel like I enjoy the particularity, the sophistication, the precision. It's kind of elegant, but whew, it's a lot. It's very textured. Lots of textured perceptions, lots of fast textured perceptions. All right, lots of structure. Architectonics, that's the word Ed Casey used. We did critique of judgment my first semester in grad school, and that's the same one that I read you the Mitsumi paper for. And guys, that was brutal. I didn't understand most of that. Um, I remember that the intellect and the imagination are mutually quickened through some kind of telos about nature's inherent purposivity towards beauty and meaning. I also remember something about the sublime being the experience of the fear of God while simultaneously being safe. It's fun. It's just it can feel like a game if if it gets too complex or if it gets too removed from reality or from its consequences or from like helping people. It's useful whenever it's true and whenever it justifies a good world and whenever it works. Anyway, thanks for being here. See you soon.